When it comes to Asian American studies, many know that the Chinese came to the U.S. during the Gold Rush, or even earlier, and that the Vietnamese came to the U.S. after the Vietnam War. But when it comes to Indian American migration, little is known. Perhaps it is because the Indian American migration was so sporadic, spread over 100 years over different parts of the United States, and due to different circumstances. Vivek Bald's Bengali Harlem pieces together the little-known history of some of the first documented Indians in New York City. Bald's story focuses on a few main people: Ibrahim Chowdhury, Habib Ullah, and his wife Victoria Echevarria Ullah. They were the founders of the Bengal Garden, a restaurant they opened near Times Square in 1948. But before we delve into that, we must understand, what did the world look like 100 years ago? Where did the Indians in Vivek Bald's novel come from? And why did they leave? Knowing all this, we must ask ourselves, what impact did this little-known history have, and how did it affect subsequent generations of Indian Americans? Ibrahim Chowdhury in particular had fled India after his student activism caught the attention of British authorities. He worked on a ship and eventually landed in New York City. Many of these early Indians that found their way into Harlem came from a similar background to that of Chowdhury. They were mostly men who had worked at sea, Muslim, and came from the Bengal region of India. According to Bald, Harlem in the 1900s was the epicenter of the African American world. While this is an undeniable fact, it was also home to various other minority groups: Jamaican, Puerto Rican, West Indians, Colombians, and soon enough a small population of Indians. These Indian men, like their neighbors, found jobs as unskilled laborers and service workers: porters, elevator operators, dishwashers, factory laborers, servers, etc. In Bald's words, the minorities of Harlem found themselves facing racial power in New York that were in some ways as oppressive as those they left behind. Regardless of ethnicity, Black, Hispanic, or Indian, everyone in Harlem shared in their struggle. And so these Indian men became a deeply integrated part of the community. Interrace marriages were common, and Indian men often married Puerto Rican and Black women. These interrace families contributed to a new, modified culture that was forming in Harlem. But more than just the normalcy of interrace relationships in Harlem, these marriages shined a light on the emergence of Indians in a white-dominated community. Archives of marriage documents in the 1920s and 30s show Indian men listed as white, colored, Black, Indian, East Indian, and pretty much any label you can think of. The inability of racial America to place Indians in a box became a recurring theme for these early Indian migrants. Over the course of 2 decades, the Bengali community became intertwined with the Harlem community. Bald points out that more than anyone, the men who worked at hot dog stands around the city became synonymous with the Bengali community. They were friendly faces and they socialized with those who came by. They created a sense of understanding and trust for their community. Bald states, these men became a part of the everyday social landscape of Harlem, serving and interacting with the whole range of people who lived and worked in the neighborhood. They were also key to maintaining a fabric of community among the different Indian men and their families in the area. By the 1930s and 40s, some of these same Indian men, well known in their communities, who had spent years working in the service restaurant industry, became inspired to open their own Indian restaurants in Harlem. Unlike the other population of Indians, particularly Hindus, Punjabis, and Ceylonese peoples, who had managed to curate high-class Indian restaurants that appealed to New York's elite class, the restaurants created by Bengali families from Harlem were very simplistic. They often couldn't compete with bigger, fancier Indian restaurants frequented by whites. Regardless of widespread appeal, these restaurants were quite popular among Harlem residents, and were cultural hubs. In a sense, they were community centers, places where Indian men could meet, speak in their native languages, and discuss the changing dynamics of India. By the 1940s, these men, who had served as facilitators of the East Indian community through their restaurants, now found their calling as leaders of the community. Ibrahim Chowdhury, after spending some time running the Bengal Garden, created the Indian Seamen's Club for Indian maritime workers traveling through New York. Recollections from Chowdhury's son indicate that he went out of his way to help men like him who were migrating to the city. He gave people a place to stay, helped with immigration problems, led religious functions, and spoke on behalf of his community in official matters. The late 1940s brought lots of change for the Indian community. What was once known as British India was now two independent separate countries, India and East and West Pakistan. In 1947, Chaudhry Ullah and other community leaders founded the Pakistan League of America. As is often done by white communities to minority communities, the Pakistan League of America was pitted against the Indian League of America led by J.J. Singh. Though these men now represented different parts of a religiously divided British India, This wasn't necessarily a reason for the creation of a separate Pakistani League. Having lived in and established their own communities in America, social class was likely a more important factor. The leaders that had lived in Harlem for years were frustrated by a lack of representation. However, the inability of whites to place Indians, and now East Pakistanis, in a box, and the need to be recognized as American, was something both these groups shared. These leaders pushed Congress to grant citizenship rights to the large population of Indians and Pakistanis that had immigrated to the U.S. decades before. Today, over 100 years later, the United States is home to 5.4 million South Asian Americans like me. Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Sri Lankan Americans are just a few of the many South Asian groups present in the United States today. Slowly but surely, these groups have gained representation for their ethnic backgrounds and recognition of their mixed yet very American identities. Though there is still a long way to go, it is important to remember the lost history of the young maritime Muslim men from East India who created a vibrant community intertwined with the rest of Harlem and created space for generations of South Asian Americans to come.